I'm a product manager. Currently, I'm a product manager at Lyft, which hopefully all of you know or have got to know in the recent times we've been here in the US. It's a rideshare platform. So we connect drivers and riders, people who have a car and want to drive people around, to people who need to get places. That's our main business. We also have our what we call Lyft bikes, so our more urban mobility systems. They are active in. We directly manage the one in San Francisco, New York, and a few more cities, Chicago, for example. And now we're offering a little bit more B2B solutions there. But so if you're around San Francisco these days, there's bikes. If you take the bikes at the stations, those are actually managed and owned by Lyft also. Before that, I studied here. I came from Italy to the San Francisco area to study at Stanford in a Master's in Management Science and Engineering. After that, I worked at NVIDIA, which at the time not only gamers knew, and I was a little gamer, and so I did know that. I worked there as a product and project manager, mostly in the hardware systems division. So I started my career in hardware systems, putting together developer boards, consumer products, car components, and intelligent car systems, and a few others at NVIDIA for 3 to 4 years. Then I wanted to do something more software-oriented, and so I actually moved to a blockchain startup at the time, where blockchain was picking up. It was particularly NFTs. We were a gaming blockchain marketplace, so we were connecting, we were backend connecting games to a blockchain, and then we allowed the gamers to trade digital items inside the game. If you're familiar with free-to-play, like Fortnite, players right now can download the game for free, play it, and then buy items inside it. Which they get to keep. We were actually making those tokenized items so that people could actually trade them between each other. So adding an extra dimension to the game, which was actually the kind of collection and trading side, which in the physical world, with things like Magic the Gathering cards happened, and this was missing in the digital world. So that was a very exciting experience, got to build pretty much a marketplace from scratch. It didn't exist when I joined. Also saw a big growth cycle in the company. We get from 100 employees to 300 employees, raised very big rounds, also from A16Z. And then obviously the kind of bust cycle too of NFTs. We had a little bit of rough times, had to lay off a lot of people. And after that, I decided I wanted to go more in kind of bigger companies, bigger systems, which already had distribution to see how I could adopt what I'd learned in a startup environment to a bigger and operational and more critical system. So I've been working at Lyft now 1.5 years. And there I follow very core technical products. I'm part of what we call foundations team, which is usually a way to say all the technical stuff that people don't know where to put. So I do forecasting, we do communication systems to send you SMS, push, and emails, and then also work on experimentation and our machine learning platforms and infrastructures, which data scientists inside the company use to run experiments, tests, and also to develop machine learning and AI models that we are using to better optimize our operations. Today, though, I've been kind of in contact with Silicon Valley Fellowship and a few mentorship programs in Italy for a while, so I've been talking to young people, early career people, also starting their companies. And some questions that often come up, both in my work and with these consultations, are around metrics, because it's always important to measure things. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about metrics. In particular, as a product manager, metrics are very important for storytelling. So that's actually where I'd want to start our talk today. And it would be great, and I'll probably pull some of you in to see if some of you have companies. We'll see maybe what problems you're facing or what metrics you are tracking, and we can talk a little bit about those too. So let's start by defining what a metric is. Actually, this is a pretty standard product management interview question. So when I interview other product managers, there's always a part that evaluates how people define metrics. And I think of a metric usually there's 3 major dimensions. The first one is kind of what exactly, like what are you measuring? But then it's very important to say, where are you measuring it? So for example, if you're measuring revenue, is it your global revenue? Is it a particular regional revenue? Is it a particular type of revenue, particular area of revenue? And then the time. When are you measuring it? Is it last year's revenue, 2 years ago revenue, or all-time revenue? And then also the aggregation, if you are aggregating it. Is it your weekly revenue? Is it your yearly revenue? And often people, when talking about metrics, omit saying a lot of these, and they can actually cause a lot of misunderstanding between people. And we'll get to later in the talk of how metrics are actually a way to standardize communication and align people. And that's where a lot of nitpicks go wrong sometimes. But the important thing is that metrics are numbers. So they're usually they're considered to be at least less interpretable. A clear number is if you have a specific target for the year, that's a target. If you have a specific run rate, that is a run rate. If you have a specific revenue per customer, that's usually a very clear number, which everybody can align on. But the truth is actually you can modify metrics a little bit to tell your story. And especially the decision is not usually about the metric itself, but it's what metrics do you like to track in your business, in your personal performance, in your overall run rate or presentations. And so that's why metrics are an important way to storytell. Especially as a product manager in my day-to-day job, I usually have to communicate either to executives, to customers, to people outside the company, and also to people inside the company, how we are doing, which products are doing, and everybody wants to see metrics. Because saying, how is the product going, it's going well, or like, how have you been hitting your goals, kind of, is not very clear. It's very great. So people usually expect to hear, yes, we are doing well, we have hit 90% of our goals, or we have delivered X% of a project, or we have finished milestone Y, and so we are 80% or 60% or 20% done. Or also, oh yeah, we have completed the project, but the cost was a little bit higher. Now today, right now, I just use a few more relative metrics, because metrics can also be relative or absolute. If I talk about absolute metrics, is saying I sold $1 million worth of products, or my margin per revenue is $2. But often in business, you also see relative metrics. So what is our goal? Or our goal is 10% year-over-year growth. Or our objective is to increase margins by 20%. Or we achieved a better conversion rate of 5% compared to the baseline, which is always a very interesting term. And those, especially in storytelling, have a very, very critical different definition. Because for example, who of you have actually a startup or thinking about doing a startup? Who of those actually have a startup already, like incorporated? There are some people, kind of, okay, good. So one thing is, if you were presenting to your investors, prospective investor, and you say, oh, we have increased revenue 100% year over year. Well, that sounds great. But what if your revenue was 100 euros, and so this year you sold 200 euros? That's much less interesting to an investor. If you say, oh, okay, last year I had 100 euros of revenue, this year I have 200, they'll probably ignore you. So it's very important to kind of select appropriately what kind of metric, or how at least you define a metric. And keep in mind, both cases are true. You have sold 200 euros this year, and you have increased your year-over-year revenue by 100%. So technically, people can't call you out. Another very, very interesting one, especially when we talk, and we'll get into kind of layered metrics, is when people say, yeah, I know I have increased my revenue by 100%, and but 100% is 100 million, so great results. For example, at Lyft, before I joined around 2017, 18, 19, it was a big growth. So the objective was to increase the number of rides. And yes, pretty much every quarter, every year, both Lyft and Uber, which is our biggest competitor, were increasing rides significantly. There was only one problem, but we were increasing revenue, but profit was not increasing. Actually, it was negative on a per ride basis and also on a total basis. Companies were actually losing money. So that is something where you see often in the media too. People talk about, oh, OpenAI has increased revenues by $5 billion a year, but the truth is they also doubled their bottom line in the negative side, where they were losing approximately, I think, billions of dollars a year, and now they're in the $10 to $20 billion of loss every year. So they're actually losing money every year still. And so that's where we get to deciding your exact metric for the message you're giving. Because when you're talking to investors, when you're talking to media and press, it's very, very common for people to use relative metrics to pretty much say, yes, I have had, look at the positive side of this, and they tend to hide the negative part of it. So that's on the storytelling side. A few other very interesting, I'll make sure I covered all the points there. Another very interesting one, this is more when we get on the statistical side, because I follow a lot of experiments, and so you can usually decide, it's very not common to specifically say all the metrics of all your little either business area, business lines, or regionals. For example, we at Lyft, we divide the United States in approximately 400 regions, where pretty much every region is handled differently. There's different pricing, different incentives, even different driver pay, usually because of regulation. We rarely, though, say, oh, we go for all the 400 regions and say this is how we're doing here or there. And so we tend to use averages or medians or other sort of information there. And a key one, which also I think is usually actually understated, which people should use more, is the difference between averages and median. It's very, very common to have the average revenue, average return per customer, average sale price, average conversion rate. But for some things, it actually makes a lot more sense, both from a business perspective side and from a communication perspective, to use median. This is something that I learned as a product manager is very important. For example, customer service. Now, one of the key things once you get a big company is you want to minimize customer service time and expense. Customer service is usually seen as a cost center, even though there's obviously companies which try to make that a positive point or somewhere where you want to surprise and delight the user. Like at Lyft, for example, we have a few initiatives that focus around surprising users that have to, for whatever reason, contact customer center. But in most of the narrative, things that you track in customer service time are time to completion of requests. So whenever somebody messages your customer service, usually for a complaint, for a question, you want to minimize the time it takes for you to answer, and then minimize the time you actually spend interfacing, so a number of messages back and forth, or what's called the open time of a ticket. So usually when somebody writes in, you may have received this via email, you get a ticket number, and so a ticket is open until the agent, or usually a timeout, figures out that there's nothing more to be said there and closes down the ticket. So what usually happens in the customer service is a lot of the tickets usually get handled within what's called SLA, so service level agreement, and we can talk a little bit about that later. However, there's always some tickets which take a long time, like way longer. So let's say that if you had 10 tickets or 9 tickets, and 9 tickets took you 1 day to answer, and then you have a 10th ticket, which is either a very complicated system or has a customer which is malicious in the sense that they're trying to get something from your customer service which you don't expect them to, Pretty common, for example, last year with Air Canada, where a customer managed to get their AI bot of Air Canada to promise them a refund, which they were not actually entitled to. And so these customers might essentially be continuously bugging you, and they are effectively for your company a loss. Like, they're usually not a net positive customer in a B2C sense. And they can continue and extend your ticket time for a long time. So let's say that you're a product manager, a project manager, or even a manager of a team, and at the end of the month, you take a look at those 10 tickets. If you actually take a look at the average resolution time, it's going to be pretty high, because let's say that for 9 of them it took 1 day, but for the last one it took a whole month, your average is going to be way higher than 1 day. But if you took it at medium, it is going to be 1 day, which is kind of actually more of representative of the experience that you're doing. And so those are key differences in deciding when to use a medium, when to use an average. In general, when you care about most of the time, medium is a little bit more of a better metric, because it does take into account how many times people contact you or use your product or use your service, and then how much do they actually how much is your reasonable case. But then in the extreme cases, average takes into account the extreme cases. And for some projects, the extreme cases might be very important. For example, if you're thinking about, I don't know, like resolution times for aircraft issues. As we know, there's been a lot of issues with aircraft. So if you're a Boeing repair center, and you do most of your repairs in 1 day, but then a few repairs take extremely long, you probably want to focus on those extremely long repair times. You don't want to ignore them. You actually want to look at what are the issues causing very long repair times. But in cases where customer service is like 99% of your customer tickets are served within your SLA, then that extremely long time might just be very, very hard to take down, and maybe not worth your time to focus on. So averages and medians are also something I've been focusing on at work, and also with a few other startups we're talking to. And so these are all ways where you have to be very careful in terms of what is the story you're telling, who are you telling it to, and also what behavior you want to push with a metric. And now we're going to get into the second part, which is metrics not as a story, but actually as an alignment tool. If you start a startup now, if you're working with a few people, alignment usually is not a big problem, because you're either in the same room, in the same Slack channel, in the same WhatsApp channel. You get to talk very often, so there's usually not a lot of misunderstanding. As companies grow, instead, you got to start doing what I call pretty much offline management, where you're interfacing, communicating with people, but you're not in the same room, you're not in the same time, and you might not even be on the same chat at the same moment, where somebody can write a question and somebody can answer immediately. So you start having to doing a lot of offline and async communication and management. Why are metrics very important in that case? Because metrics are used as an alignment tool. Meaning, if you're the CEO of a company or you have your own line of business and you go out and say, this year we want to improve, let's say, the number of rides, just like Lyft was doing 2017, 2018, 2019. And you tell that's the one thing we care about. Everybody needs to go out and figure out how to increase the number of rides that are being taken on our platform. And that is what people will be doing, because it's a metric. So first of all, you shouldn't say number of rides, but maybe you have to say your monthly number of rides, your yearly number of rides in a specific area, which for Lyft was the United States, to make it specific in the time and place, as we talked earlier. But then everybody knows how to measure that, and ideally it should be automatically measurable. We'll also get into that. And so everyone in your company will be focused on how do we increase the number of rides. But keep in mind that you've specifically said number of rides. You haven't said if every ride should bring in money or lose money. You haven't said if you can use coupons to get those rides or not. You even also didn't say if the rides have to be real rides or if there's some accounting hat that can happen to increase rides, because that's always what people will look for. If you give them an objective, they will actually try to maximize the objective. And so that's why, and then that's kind of what happened. You're going to come back at the end of the month, at the end of the year, and every part of the team will say, oh, I did this to increase the number of rides. So if you choose the right objective, it's actually very powerful, because you don't have to go and talk with every single person every day to figure out that they're doing the right thing, because everybody will know that they need to increase rides. But at the same time, if you don't specify what's called guardrail metrics, you risk that some people will go out and give out rides for free, because that ultimately gives you more rides. Or people will spend too much in marketing, because that ultimately gives you rides. But you didn't say that you were not supposed to use money from the marketing side. Even though it can be considered usually obvious, it's not. When you put an objective in front of people, that's the objective they go for. And so that we just introduced the second alignment, which is not just your what's called top-line metric or major metric, but it's also your guardrail metrics. Usually you need to maximize top-line metrics. Guardrail metrics are things that you don't really care unless you pass a threshold. It could be a positive or negative threshold, depending on the metric. So for example, at Lyft now, we are not just trying to increase the number of rides that people take on our platform. We actually want to increase the number of rides that people take on our platform with a minimum threshold of a profitability per ride, which means we want to make at least X on a per ride basis. And that gives a clear feedback to people that, yes, you need to increase your rides, but you cannot go beyond this line, which means if to create a ride costs you, or maybe if a ride gets you X dollars and it's 10 cents below the threshold, you should not do that. Now, obviously, we didn't say on every ride. We said you need to maximize the number of rides we were getting every quarter with a guardrail of an average cost per ride. And here average is actually very important, because we don't care as much as the median profit per ride, because if 90% of rides gets us a median profit, but 10% cost a lot of money, we're still going to lose money. So actually that's the case where average cost of a ride or average revenue per profit per ride is actually pretty important instead of your median. You really care about those edge cases where you make a lot of money per ride and where you make no money per ride, or even potentially lose money per ride. So that's kind of tying it all together. And that's actually the objective that every team is set. And every team at the end of the quarter, when we do our quarterly reviews, which is a common time frame for stock-listed companies, Lyft is available on the stock market. Every quarter we actually review that, how much each team has brought in terms of rides, but also if they have affected the profitability on a per ride basis, because we want to make sure that no team is actually losing money for the company. Now, let's talk about cascading metrics, because the fact is, as I told you earlier, I work on what's called a foundations team. So we do forecasting models, we do messaging infrastructure. We actually don't influence directly the number of rides, other than the ones that I personally go and take when I'm outside in San Francisco. We don't actually do that. So then a problem of metrics, when you use them for alignment, is that some people might feel like they've been left out. Some teams of a company might feel like they've been left out, and they cannot really directly influence the number of the metrics. And that is usually a big problem, because when you look at the top line level, for example, the CEO level, you usually care about revenue, profit, usually proxies of these two in terms of user activity on the platform, or proxies for profitability, or if it's a B2B company, maybe recurring revenue or number of churned users and churned customers. And the problem is, the bigger the company gets, the more some teams get further away from this metric definition. And so what usually happens is that metrics cascade, meaning from my side, for example, forecasts. I know that it's important for us to know when there's a rider and when there's a driver, where are they going to be? Like, where are people going to be taking rides? Where are people going to be driving? Because we need to ensure there's a balance of the two. And so if I'm accurate or not very accurate, I'm not going to directly create rides. But if I can give a good sense of where drivers and riders are going to be to the teams that decide pricing, to the teams that decide how much a driver is going to get paid, then they can actually work better and create more rides. So for me, I cannot take that top line primary metric for my team. But when people tell me, oh, you need to increase rides, we have a minimum set of profitability, I need to go to my teams and say, what we can do in the forecasting side is we can give accurate forecasts, because the more accurate we give forecasts, the better it is for the teams that we support to actually go and create rides with a minimum profitability. The one important thing there, though, is that sometimes the metrics that we're optimizing for can be, at least the secondary metrics or the third metrics, so the ones that depend from the first level, can actually be a little bit too extreme. Meaning, one key thing that a lot of engineering teams work on, so again, a platform team that's supporting the rest of the company, they usually work on what's called support tasks, or essentially enabling other teams to do their job. And so and usually they're measured around, they're not measured, what they do on a day-to-day basis is ship new features to the product, or ship new users to, for example, a machine learning platform or an experimentation platform, which other people inside the company use. So a very common metric that people come to me and say, especially engineers, are like, oh, we're working on this project, we work very hard, I want to show you that we can deliver projects faster. So I want to measure how quickly I can ship this product. So I'm going to select an arbitrary milestone of this product and say, it's going to take me 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks, we're going to check if I've done it in 2 weeks, if I've done it in a week and a half, or if I did it 2.5 weeks. And so the metric pretty much is time to delivery of a feature. Now, the problem of that, and it's something we didn't mention at the start, is that metrics have to be very clearly measurable. And ideally, they don't need to be made by someone. They need to be automatically measured. So there's actually a book called Exponential Organizations that talks about companies in pretty much nowadays. And they're saying the hypothesis of the book, which has not been proven yet, is that companies will, especially software companies, will go more and more towards a world where you need less and less people to actually operate, because the software is going to do a lot of the work. And what they say is a key power or a key enabler for these companies will be automated dashboard which pull on automated metrics. So the idea that someone can say, for example, I care about my resolution time of a ticket, I care about the revenue I get, I care about the logins of specific customers on a specific platform, and every week, every day, every hour, depending on how often the cadence of the metric is, I get that information automatically. So a good metric is something that you can configure to automatically send it to you, and usually you're going to put it in a dashboard so that you or someone in your company can actually read that and can get it automatically in a non-debatable way. Because when I get with engineers and they say, okay, we're going to deliver this feature in 2 weeks, the problem is that a week in, you might realize that maybe you didn't need 80%, 20% of a milestone, or that some extra additional part of the feature was not needed. And so you actually start changing what you're going to deliver in order to hit the deadline. Or even worse, because you said you're going to hit the deadline in 2 weeks, people are going to rush to do the project and screw up some of the project because they were measured on how quickly they were delivering the deadline. So that is actually a risk of an arbitrary metric, which different people can manipulate, and that ultimately doesn't go towards the main goal of what the company is trying to achieve. It's particularly ideal with a lot of engineering teams and kind of this what we call platform teams, so teams that internally do products for the rest of a company. And it's usually a challenge to actually measure the right metrics, because if you do adopt these time to delivery of a feature, or even some things such as computation time or execution time of models, for example, if you're in a machine learning model, it's always important to, you would say, it's usually you want to make your models training faster, so that a scientist can upload a model and it gets trained faster so that it's available to the public. But the fact is, some models train overnight, where every night they train and they refresh the values which are going to be used for the next day. Cutting down the training time of a model from, let's say, 4 hours to 3 hours, if it's running overnight, doesn't really change much, because it's still going to be ready the next day. Obviously, it's better for a model to run in less time, but if we have time to spend from an engineering team and we can decide to reduce that or maybe do something else, the other thing that we're doing would actually have more impact. And so there's always a risk of over-indexing on some metrics, which kind of makes sense to optimize, but only up to a certain extent. Let's talk about now something that you may have heard of, and I would say are fairly controversial up to nowadays, which are OKRs and KPIs. Now, you might have read a lot about them. KPI, ultimately, I think is just a way to say an automated metrics, which reads and gives you like a reading every once in a while. And usually they can either be set as a threshold of like we are aiming to hit a reading of this metric. So for example, $10 million of recurring revenue every month. So meaning every month we take a look at all our revenue of our company and we see if it hits $10 million or not. But the key thing there is that every month I get my number of revenue and I can evaluate it. So that's purely KPI, pretty much a metric that I evaluate continuously and I get automatically read continuously. And that's usually not controversial, but then when we get to OKRs, that's where it gets a little bit controversial. So what are OKRs? Very big thing for product managers, at least around here. It's not been my past two companies which people really focus on OKRs. By the way, NVIDIA is not focused on OKRs at all because I work there, so some people might be interested. So OKRs are what it's called objective and key results. It's a methodology that was invented at Intel a while back when Intel was started, and that then was heavily adopted at Google. So both companies say they were made successful by OKRs. And what it stands for is that the kind of top of the company, the leads of a company, would say these are our objectives, usually 3 to 5 for the year or the quarter. They usually refresh quarterly, but you can set them by year. I guess a normal cadence is you set an OKR for the year, and every quarter you do a readout. And you can do it more often. For example, you can refresh OKRs every 6 months or 3 months, and you can do readings also much more often. Like, for example, once a month you actually read how you're doing. And the objective of these are metrics or KPIs, which you specify what you want to achieve, you say. And the objective is usually it's always better if it's numeric. Sometimes it's not numeric, it's more aspirational. And then there's KRs, which are specific metric readings that you want to achieve. And there's usually 3 to 5 for each objective. So 3 to 5 objectives, 3 to 5 KRs for each objective. And they are a way to, mostly seen as what we said before, to align the company to achieve a specific objective for the year. And so the idea is that the leads of a company, the heads of a company, the executive suite, whatever, set up these OKRs. And then each team picks the KRs that they can influence. So again, because not all teams can influence all objectives or OKRs. And then they essentially take a KR, they make it their objective, and then they break that objective down into other KRs for their specific team, and so on. And so the bigger the team, the bigger the company, the more layers there are. Each layer does this. Because what happens is it's very easy. When you're at the top, it's very easy to define an objective. For example, get $10 million of recurring revenue every year, or cut our costs by half, or achieve per unit profitability in what we're doing. Those are all pretty good objectives, or even KRs to some extent. But then when you go lower and lower, when you start getting to things such as customer service or platform teams or operational teams, it's not always obvious what is the right thing to measure. And what risk is that sometimes people, again, because people want to hit their KRs, tend to make them either too simple or also target things that are very easily measurable. And then maybe they don't do some stepwise huge changes which they could do to really bring the company forward. So it's something that really pushes incremental improvements, but is not really, I mean, at the time it did, but right now I haven't seen many companies do them to get really big improvements. Which is why, if you think about it, Intel and Google, which pretty much were the two biggest pushers of OKRs, haven't really been innovating a lot in the past 10 to 20 years, let's put it that way. And so it's a pretty controversial topic in PMs. There's been a lot of MBA folks really love OKRs because there's a lot of case studies around them. But from a practical standpoint, I have not been able to really use them, especially in highly engineering teams, to really drive alignment and performance. Because actually there is alignment, but the alignment is usually let's work on things that are easily measurable and not work on really things that could bring us forward. For example, AI investments. So if you have something that you've been doing with normal code and you're looking, how can AI change my processes? It's really pretty hard until after you've done it to set up an objective of KR because you don't really know how much AI or even ML algorithms will be able to work. And so it's pretty hard to put some KRs to that because they might really change how you're doing things on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's a pretty important mention because they are, especially in Silicon Valley, they do have this let's say they're pretty famous, and also VCs sometimes want to push teams to adopt them, and I don't say it's not always the right thing to do, depending on your team.
What's the right thing to do?
It depends on what you're doing on the team. So I would say, usually, I mean, there's two types of models on metrics, and I mentioned because there's always some level of metrics you have to do for storytelling. From a team organization perspective, the smaller you are, you usually can actually get along with no metrics, pretty much very low metrics, in terms of really focus on what your objective is, what you want to set out to do and launch. In a 0 to 1 world, metrics are not that important, I've seen, where you're like launching a project from scratch. In an iteration world, then it becomes important to really focus on alignment. And let's talk about actually what are the right things to do. Because there was a very famous post that I've seen like 5 to 6 years ago, which unfortunately I couldn't find, which was essentially a summary of what do startups put in their pitch decks. And it was a rank of metrics. Because really the top things people want to talk about is revenue or even better profit. If you can show that you've got profit or revenue, that's a great thing. But when you're a startup, when you're launching a product, you might not have profit and revenue, that's fine. So what is the second type of kind of a step down? What would people show in their metrics was, well, if you could have essentially customers' engagement and using the platform, so it was actually usage statistics of people actually logging in, using the product, recurring users of the product. So actually people that continue and use the product continuously. The third part then was if people even didn't have that, they didn't actually have a big user base, they didn't have users which continue to use the product, they would just use new users, which effectively means someone that used your product once. So that's more of a metric of marketing, where people would come in your product, maybe you give it a free sign-up, maybe you spend a lot of marketing, and people would come and start using the product, and then drop suddenly, which was a big one, especially in the crypto. I think crypto and blockchain, in our previous company, we had a lot of people using the games and then doing maybe one purchase, which was like what we were trying to, it's important, that's a transaction of money, and then completely stopping or not doing another purchase again, maybe because they didn't see the value, maybe because it was just gaming retention is very hard, so people play a game for like 2 weeks and then they move on to the next game because there's something bigger. And so when companies would use that metric of like first users or first activations or paying users, first paying users. And then after that, you get to the point where maybe if you also didn't have that, then you usually report on active users which are not paying. So people which have used your let's say you use your product, but they're not really paying, or maybe they just doing a free subscription and then leaving, doing a trial period and then leaving. And even if people didn't have that, then they will report on things such as signups or emails, like signups to email lists. So things that people would give data, because that's still seen as a minimal friction point of like, we got data on X many customers, we have X many leads, and so that's something that I can use to measure how well I'm doing for the product, but it's still pretty far away from success. And then the last thing, and there's been a fun story, one of my startups I'm following is things such as websites visits. So people are like, oh, I have a website and I have X many website visitors every year or every week, every month. And that is, again, it may be a good proxy metric, but it's a very proxy metric. Between somebody visiting your website and somebody becoming a user or whatever platform, either if it's B2C or B2B, there's quite a few steps you need to go through. And so when a startup would come up and say, oh, we have this many visitors on our website, or we have this many visitors signed up to our email list, or another one which I've seen popular now is we have this many followers on LinkedIn or on social media, it kind of sends a message that you're missing on all the other metrics. Pretty much you don't have anything else. So that's also in kind of a storytelling of when you go and talk to maybe VCs, investors, external people. It's important to really think that if you choose a metrics, there's a whole set of other metrics you're choosing not to show, and so people will actually know that. Now, a fun one then is also you need to really cater your metric to your type of business. And here what I usually see as a mistake that people do is they have a B2B company where they're selling something to other companies, whether it's SaaS or maybe services to companies or supply chain services and so on. Or even AI services. And however, because you read a lot of literature, you read a lot of books, or even some VCs, which maybe are not super used to B2B, are more known to B2C, they push B2C metrics on these companies. So for example, if you have a B2B company, especially one which requires a sales process, contract signing, which could be, for example, energy, defense, or healthcare, which is usually very still manual and sitting down, even for SaaS. Measuring things such as engagement on your website, sign-ups to newsletter is not that important, because ultimately how you're going to get your customers is by going to talk to some leads, sitting down with them, explaining the product, signing a contract. And so measuring things such as your sales funnel is actually a lot more important than measuring even how your product gets worked. Because in some sectors, finance, and not fintech, but like bank, finance, healthcare, energy, very legacy, oil and gas, very legacy sectors where there's actually a lot of potential for innovation. Usually the person that you need to convince to actually buy your product is definitely not the person that's going to use your product. And then actually something that somebody told me last week in IT, yeah.
From industry to industry, there is a different combination of metrics. Some are to maximize, some should be maximized, and other minimize from industry to industry?
Yeah, I guess every industry depends, and what it really depends on is your user flow. And by user, it's not just user, because user is a very SaaS and kind of internet company term, but it's usually your customer flow. So for in a B2B company, you should, for me, what I at least push people to think about is always your sales funnel. Like how many people are you interfacing with, how many companies you're interfacing with, how many agree on a meeting with you, how many look at your demo, how many follow up to your demo, up to signing a contract. But instead, for a B2C company, then it's much more important to look at the more traditional user funnel of how many people download the product, how many people sign up, how many people maybe pay, do your first payment, how many people return then after they've done the first payment.
Another question actually is, in every industry, there will be kind of always, so for example, let's say 2 hospitals. Those 2 hospitals or 3 or 10 hospitals, the combination of metrics that they use in the metrics that need to be maximized and that need to be minimized are the same. For example, same industries, same combination of...
Usually yes. And so that's what you, actually, if you're interested to know what are the metrics of a particular industry that they care about, what you can usually go is on the companies selling to that industry. So for example, let's say that, we talked about hospitals. Let's say that there's, for example, Cost Plus Drugs is a new startup. It's a huge company now by Mark Cuban, aiming to sell prescriptions to people online by cutting down a few people in middlemen. So they have to, on one side, capture user, like end consumers who need prescriptions, but on the other side, they need to talk to hospitals and the doctors. And I'm a little bit, like it's not 100% true, but I'm making an example which works here. And so they need to cater to patients on one side, but also to hospitals and doctors on the other. So whereas a patient might care about how much they're paying, how the convenience of getting things to them, but if you're interested in like what do doctors and hospitals care about, if you go on their website, I'm sure you might be able to find some metrics which they are catering to hospitals in terms of maybe only takes X time to train a person to use it, or only take X time for us to ship medicines to your hospital and so on. I'm making this up. I'm actually not an expert of the sector, but usually if you find a company that's selling to your same customer, go and look what metrics they say or how they're selling themselves to the company, because that's usually the metrics that the industry cares about. And you'll be very surprised because it's not very obvious. So for example, I was talking to someone yesterday and we were comparing Microsoft services to Google services, like just Microsoft Word, Microsoft Server versus GCP. And what this person told me, and I think he had been working in Microsoft many years ago, he said, Microsoft is amazing for IT administrators. If you're actually a person of that company and use a Microsoft product, it doesn't work very well for you. But the key thing is Microsoft isn't selling to you as an employee of this company. They're selling to the IT administrator who's buying the Microsoft product and then pushing it on all the people in the company. And so what IT administrators cares about are very different from what you as a software engineer in whatever company or a salesperson care about. And that's why, like, if you've been driving around San Francisco, a few common things that have been coming up are there's a lot of companies which offer SOC 2 compliance as a service, pretty much. And if you're building a company today, if you're a small company, who cares about SOC 2, industrial compliance, SSO, all those things? Because like, why do you need them? You can like launch a product, you can log in. But those are the things that you need to sell to a big enterprise, because there's all these security teams which pretty much only care about SOC 2 compliance, SOX compliance if you have finance things, SSO, like security, like single sign, not single sign-on, but it's like user-based control. I forget, there's an acronym for that too. And so all these companies are essentially saying, oh, if you want to sell to them, we can give you the metrics. For example, do you do that? Do you have this level of uptime? Do you have all these tracking things, which according to these supposedly guidelines you need to have to sell to these companies. But the truth is, that as a user of a company, you probably don't have too much interface with that. Actually, it might be worse. For example, Lyft is a big company, and so we have SSO, so single sign-on. So whenever I'm logging into things, I need to go through a third-party provider, which makes sure that I am myself. And it's very annoying, because if I have 10 tabs on Google Chrome, they actually tend to refresh at different times. So at different times I'm working, and I get asked to sign in just to make sure that it's me and not someone didn't steal my laptop and is stealing all the stuff. It's very annoying, but it's needed if you want to sell to a big company, because the security team cares about it, even though the end user of a company really would prefer to never have to log in anywhere. So what's thing? And actually, so going back to what I said, it's important to understand what are the metrics which are going to bring you success, because if you are selling to a big company, the IT administrator might be the actual person who says, yes, we're going to use a product, instead of the 200 software engineers in that company which want to say, oh, they offer much better AI code completion versus they offer much better deployment of systems and so on. So it's very important to understand how your funnel works, your sales funnel works, because those people in the sales funnels are going to be the ones you need to some extent, win over. So quick time check. Okay, we good for most of it. Yeah, so we talked about that. Yeah, number one is so we talked a little bit about B2B, but kind of a sales funnels. In B2C, instead, you also have to be very careful what your value proposition is, because one particular metric which is very far away from my heart, meaning I hate it, is CSAT, which is something that many companies measure their customer satisfaction with. So for example, CSAT is the usual question you get asked of, would you recommend this product to others on a scale from 0 to 10? And it's seen as a proxy for customer satisfaction, because the truth is, a lot of people have been trying to measure customer satisfaction, but it's really, really hard, because we couldn't say how satisfied we are with a product. For example, I use Google Docs. How satisfied am I with a product? I can't really tell you. I can say, yeah, I like it or I don't like it, but it's not an easily an objective way to measure things. And especially, there's no way for me to, once a week, give a reading on how much I feel about Google Docs. So people ask these things where we pretty much show a questionnaire and fill it up. Now, keep in mind, we said that earlier metrics ideally are automatically generated. So a lot of companies with CSAT nowadays try to send out these automated surveys. But they're actually I feel they're pretty bad indications, because you don't really know what you're measuring. You're trying to measure a proxy for user retention, because the idea is if somebody likes your product, they're going to continue using it. So why actually measure things like CSAT if you can actually measure user retention? So this is actually from the D school at Stanford, the design school, what they are big proponents, for example, of what some of you, as I'm sure you will be hearing this week, of going out and meeting the customers and talking to the customers. But you have to be very careful. Talking to a customer is important, but it's not as a way to score yourself or score your products. A lot of teams tend to talk to the customers specifically because they want to get validation of their products. They want to say, oh, how satisfied are you with this feature, or how satisfied are you with this? But the truth is talking to customers is very important to really understand what is the next pain point that they have, the next thing that you want to solve for. A much better way to measure customer satisfaction is to see their retention, their usage. How are they using their product? Are they using your product? And so on. And another big mistake that some teams do is, and this is because a lot of the literature have come out of Instagram and Facebook about product use, where for Instagram and Facebook and social networks, it makes sense for you, like they want you to spend as much time as you can on their platform, because their revenue is 100% tied to that. The more you stay on the platform, the more ads you see, the more revenue they have. For some products, it's quite the opposite. Even, for example, a fintech product. Let's say there's a bank. You put your money in the bank, or you put your money in like an investment platform. They actually, once you put the money in, unless they think that you can put more money in, but so the more time you're going to be spending looking at like your investments, the more money you're going to put in. It's actually much better to have you not look at that and forget about it. Let's say that there's a robo-advisor, which is a typical product now, where you put in your money and like your money is automatically invested. The more you will look at that, the more you might think, oh, this is amazing, I want to put more money. But there's also a chance that the more you look at it, the more you say, actually, this is not doing as well as I could, I want to put it somewhere else. So for special products, and this is true in B2C, but especially true in B2B, where there's kind of like recurring revenue, recurring payments, it's actually sometimes better for you to minimize the time your customer has to think about your product and just pay. So that's why in B2B, there's this huge attention to companies to get them signed up and enrolled, and after that, they kind of tend to disappear. So I've done a lot of integrations, so there's a lot of sales managers, sales engineers, solutions architects that come in and talk to you and want to make sure that you're happy, that you want to migrate all your data to it, and after that, they disappear. When you ride with them, they don't answer, because they really want you to ideally not think about the integration, just use it, get used to it, and just keep, don't make you doubt your past choices. So that's why the metrics of engagement are also very dangerous, because you have to decide what type of company you're. If you actually do need your user to be very engaged, log into your platform every day, or if actually you just care the user to kind of log in once, do a recurring purchase, and forget about it. Even technically, things like Netflix or Hulu are a little bit like that, where they want the user to use it so they feel the benefit. But if a user is not using it very often, they kind of prefer the user to forget about it and continue paying the subscription instead of actually reconsidering it every time. Yes?
So what do great product managers do differently, and how do they choose then their metrics? Or what are the best metrics or go-to metrics that you normally use?
Yeah, so the key thing is there's no one answer fits all. That's the hard part. That's why great product managers are great, but also, first of all, is not too many metrics. Because if you have too many, then people pick and choose, right? They say, I want to do this, I want to do that. Where ideally, there's usually, I would say with 3 to 4 metrics, each team can have a few key things to measure. Now, by team means that if you handle multiple teams, the metrics might actually be different for every team. And then not changing them very often, because that's another thing which, for example, even a Lyft has happened lately, where last year the focus was on one thing, and then Q4 the focus was another, and then in Q1 the metrics changed. And so when you change the metrics too often, your company's resetting every time. And so people, first of all, get frustrated, because let's say you've been working for 6 months to increase the number of rides, and suddenly somebody comes and tells you and says, the important thing is to cut costs. And so then suddenly all the things you were doing to increase your rides were actually maybe increasing costs, and so you have to undo a bunch of things you did before. So changing the metrics is the hard part, which means that if you're a growing company, you actually have to think 2 or 3 stages ahead. Because what you maximize in today, for example, to sign your first customer, it's probably not the right metrics to, for example, let's say that you're selling a machine learning retraining algorithm. So you want to show to win the first customer, you want to retrain as fast as you can.
So what you're saying is you try to make, if you start a startup, so try to come up with metrics that are general and more useful for the impact in long term.
Yeah, not super long term either, right? Usually, so that's why you hear a lot of like 3 to 5 year plans. But in tech, that doesn't exist. Like 3-year plans make no sense, mostly because the environment changes so often that there's no. If the plan you have today is the plan you'll be following in 3 years, something is wrong. Or you're maybe working with oil and gas and hospitals, which take a long time. But usually, in most cases, it's wrong. But then at the same time, you also don't want to do like I know some companies, like when we were at Mythical, which was a startup, we literally had 2-week plans. Like, we didn't plan beyond 2 weeks because we didn't know where we would be because the crypto market was changing every week. And that also wasn't ideally because we were hitting our short-term milestones, but then at some point we realized we were off in the vision. Or we were over-indexing on blockchain. Instead, blockchain to some extent had disappeared, that we had been less interested in blockchain and more interested in our marketplace solution, but we had over-indexed on the blockchain side. So you kind of always need that, I would say 6 months out. 6 months, you should have a clear 6 months plan. For things such as hardware, it might go to 1 year just because it takes a year to build a hardware product, but that's a really solid plan and a metric you should think about, which is why OKRs originally were yearly OKRs. They were invented by Intel.
I have a more specific question. We have a department called Innovation Education, where we do the hackathons, workshops, events, podcasts. How do we define what are the best KPIs to define to find out if it works or not? Like, of course, it is almost student-led, so it's per semester. We check on our KPIs not quarterly. So maybe we do 2 talks, 2 events, and how do we measure then our success? What are the best metrics?
So that's interesting because you said we have a department. So first of all, when you say, oh, I have a department, I have a team, is there something above it? Like, is there like a bigger organization? Because metrics should always be aligned across the company. Yeah.
I mean, the bigger organization would be to, the goal is to create a Munich, the global hub of robotics. So we have engineering projects, but also this project where we encourage students and or connect students with industry. So, but my key question is like the KPIs on the
small side, yeah. So my first thing would be you have to clarify the bigger, because even you said you want to create a big robotics hub. Like, what does that mean? First, probably you should work with them to understand what their goals are. But let's say that whatever, they don't have them, and that's what happens. Sometimes you're in the middle layer of management, and your top level managers don't collaborate very well, meaning they change metrics every 2 weeks, or they change things. Sometimes that happens, and so you have to kind of insulate your team. So let's look at that. You said we connect students, and we do something like 2 events, let's say a quarter. Yeah. So a first level metric, first draft would be, we want to measure how many events we do. But then we're going back to the engineering team problem, which I said before, which is, we're measuring how much our output is. But the key thing is, that doesn't really measure your success, because you could do 2 events a year and they're empty, right? So another one is like you want to actually reach, you said, so the second one is, okay, well, why am I doing 2 events a year and not 4 and not 1? Because the idea is the more events you do, the more people you reach. So then it could be a second tier metric, second order of thought metric might be, let's see how many students are participating in our events. Now, if you want to get a little bit more specific, because we said we would like metrics to be specific, now the risk is you do 3 events and you have 200 students per event. Great, that's 600 students. But actually it's not, because the people who went to the first event go to the second event and then go to the third event. So it's only 200 students. Now suddenly you're like, okay, let's say every event costs money. So I've done 3 events, but I'm still reaching 200 users or 200 people. Like, I do 4 events, it's still 200 people every time. So then maybe my correct metric is unique people. Let me get unique people, and it's good if I do more events, they come more often, but I want to actually reach more people around that. Well, but the key thing is, the next step is, so what are you going to do differently, first of all? If you say, I just want to reach X number of people at our events versus I want to reach unique number of people at our events, what you're going to do is that for each event, you're going to think about how can I get more people to join, or at least the people who didn't come the first time to come the second time, which is actually going to change your actions, because let's say you do robotics and you were focused on drones. Drones are considered robots to some extent. If before you could do 3 events on drones, now the second event you're going to say, like, you know what, I already got the drone population. Let me maybe get medical robots, people who are interested in medical robots, and try to get more people there. So that already, thinking about that metric, is going to change how you do your planning. But then again, let's say you got all these students, like what is the net outcome of? Because you said you want your robotics organization, you probably actually want students to engage in robotic projects and robotic companies, right? Because you said you connect companies to students. So then the real reason you want as many students as you want is because you want more of the students to apply to robotics companies and to get a job there. So then your metric might actually not be, I want to reach unique students at our events. Your objective might be, I want a student who has interface with us. I want to maximize the number of students who have interface with us by means of coming to at least 1 event to actually go and get a job at one of our companies. And that is a pretty good metric. And what are you going to have? That actually metric is going to bring something else, which is, now suddenly you need companies. Because if you have all these students for all these events, but then there's no companies, you cannot get your goal of getting people employed in a company, which is actually sounds like pretty important for your business to have companies interested in robotics and as part of your ecosystem. So then you might have a second metric, right? So one metric, because now you start looking like a marketplace, which is part of what I do. You need supply and then you need demand. So you would have a metric on demand, let's call it that students are demand. You need a metric on supply, meaning robotics jobs. So then another metric would be companies with a robotics job who are part of our network, I don't know, something like that. But then you would have to figure out, do you care about different types of companies? Like, do you care about 100 companies with one job? Or maybe it's more important to have 4 companies which offer 50 jobs each. So that is then, again, you'll have to see how it fits with your mission. Because, and to some extent, NGO companies are a lot harder to build the targets for compared to for-profit companies. Because for profit, at some point, you have to get to something which, am I increasing my revenue, my profit? Usually profit, actually. Profit is the ultimate. In the capitalist world, profit is the ultimate metric, but in Silicon Valley, because of free money, zero interest rates, revenue has become a little bit more of a proxy, but you have to be careful because now we're going back in the time where profit is actually important instead of revenue. Yeah.
So another question. Do you recommend any learning resources like books or courses or websites to learn the right combination of metrics to develop products in an ethical way?
Yeah, actually that's in an ethical way, you said.
Because often a big problem is that people want to choose certain methods that people will need to work upon, but often those combinations of methods can be manipulated.
Yes.
Which metrics can be like huge, but in reality the actual results aren't.
Yeah, that's the storytelling part, where a lot of, especially people at the top, want to build storytelling metrics, which are great for, I actually call that managing for press, where like you're effectively, don't ignore this, because a key part now I think of, especially the early startup life, you're effectively managing for press. Like you want to put out some products, some news, which looks good on press, because that's going to get you funding, that's going to get you attention, that's going to get you eyeballs. For example, side note, which has nothing to do with metrics, but VCs, like when you're a VC and you're investing in like 200 companies, you barely remember the companies you invested in. But VCs go to a lot of events where they talk to other VCs, where they talk to where they get to talk in public, and they need to stand out from all the other VCs. Because if I'm a rich person, I have a lot of money and I want to put it in venture, I have a ton of funds I need to choose for. So VCs are also creating their story with their investments. So sometimes they actually prefer to invest in a company which has no financial sense whatsoever, but it's just cool to say that you invested that. For example, the company that's going to resurrect mammoths, right? That was a very big one here. I think Impossible Biosciences, something like that, where it's something where there's no path to revenue in the next 10 years. It's unclear. They literally want to OGM a mammoth from like mammoth bones. But it's a very cool story if you're a VC saying, hey, I invested in that. An example, a friend of mine was here 2 weeks ago. They do genetically modified insects to essentially displace parasites. So they take a parasite, they modify it, and it's a very complicated tech where the parasite replicates for a few generations and then cannot replicate anymore, and so ultimately wipes out the population. It's meant for illnesses, agriculture, and so on, in terms of how you design bonuses, how you push drivers to drive more, and that affects ultimately the ETA, which is a key metric. So for rideshare, the key metrics, at least the key metrics for a consumer, for how someone decides, is price and ETA. So ETA is how long is it going to take for the car to actually come and pick you up. Okay. Assuming somebody in a perfect competition, which is not the case, meaning everybody always checks 2 or 3 or 4 apps because numbers way more than others every time, then those are the 2 parameters you compare with. And so in order to do that, you need to position drivers, because that's how you define ETA, and then also to some extent design your pricing. But the pricing, you would say, is a lot less differentiated.
So it's more like a difference in business models than in product.
Yeah, it's usually, the product is pretty much the same, but it's usually in how you create loyalty, both on the driver side and on the rider side. So for example, Uber has a partnership with Amex, American Express credit cards, and Lyft has a partnership with Chase, which is another big credit card provider. So that's how you actually lock in people. Now, big one that happened lately, Lyft has a partnership with Delta Airlines, where every ride you take, you got Delta points. Now Delta is switching to Uber, but Lyft also has a partnership with Alaska Airlines. And so it's kind of like you're creating more of this like bundling strategy, which is kind of what the streaming services are doing too. So for example, now Netflix is independent, but a lot of the Disney stuff is being put in with internet, where you get an internet, they say you get an internet connection, and they offer you also a TV connection for free. So they're trying to do bundling and unbundling to create competitive differences for users to choose one versus the other.
Pretty short related questions. First one, how do you combine, if you combine, metrics from different areas, different teams? Like they have product metrics, may not have nothing to do with
engineering metrics. Yeah. So that's how the cascading of metrics should work. And again, this is how things should work. but as somebody was saying earlier, but executives should put top-line metrics and they should cascade such that ideally some KRs are more related to like a product metric, and some KRs are more related to engineering metric. Or for example, there's the usual one where like a product team would be focused on increasing revenue, but then the engineering team was focused on reducing cost per unit. It was actually pretty good because the more numbers, the more volume you have, if you multiply that with a reduction in cost per volume, then actually it exponentially grows profit and revenue, also, actually both. So it's pretty good. But yeah, usually you need to make sure that it's usually kind of engineering teams. You need to make sure they are associated to a product team. And this is actually something that a lot of big companies, it's more a big company problem where you end up having some teams which are unclear who they're serving, meaning they're just like maintaining something. It's unclear who's really using it or if there's actually benefiting using. Because each product, there's a minimum level of, after your product is live, usually there's a minimum level of effort you need for support. I mean, just keeping the product alive, for example, even just upgrading your Python repository or upgrading the Node.js connection and making sure they're all forward compatible. And then there's a part of a team which is usually working on new features. I mean, it's not part of a team, usually it's time. Like ideally people rotate. But some teams where there's really not a lot of product features, I mean, at least the product features you're building don't actually increase any metrics. Ideally, you should reposition the team to do something else. Just keep the support layer. But in big companies, especially when business is good, people don't do that. And so products actually end up degrading in time because there's not the right guardrail metrics. Something I don't know, but Google, for example, Google Assistant. I know that I've had Google Assistant for a long time. I thought at the start it was pretty fast. As time has passed, I noticed that it's taking longer and longer. And my guess is that they're just adding more and more features to it, but they're not keeping track of the average response time. And so the more features you add, the more libraries you have to go, the more the response time increases. So that's a case where probably the product manager either doesn't monitor that, or maybe they are monitoring and they prefer not to monitor it or not to report on it because as it looks bad.
How do you set the baselines compared to industry?
Compared to industry is one. I would say usually it's pretty clear what the baseline is, like, or at least you experiment also. You can experiment on. Yeah, it really depends on. So there's not a really key question. So the thing of metric is it really usually depends. There's no right answer. And comparing on your competitors, if they're ahead of you, makes sense. But after a while, you need to create differentiation. So you also need to make sure that you're not saying the exact same things. For example, company A goes to a hospital and say, I can deliver you medicines in 1 day. You should obviously say, I can also deliver you medicines in 1 day. The hospital has no reason to change the provider. So you got to find some differentiation.
And last one, do you take into account second order derivatives? How?
That is yes, that's called essentially aggregating metrics. So for example, we usually, for the clarity of a team, you don't want to have more than 3 to 4 metrics. But in some cases, you do need to track a whole set of things. And so then, for example, accuracy. When we measure accuracy of forecasts, there's the accuracy of a forecast in downtown San Francisco, one in downtown New York, one in the suburbs of San Francisco, one in the suburbs of New York. Just getting an average doesn't really make sense because forecasting correct here in downtown is much more important than forecasting in the middle of the hills and whatever. And so then you need to start weighing different things. So you have to say, my accuracy here is more important than the accuracy there. But then by how much? Do we make it up? Do we just say that's worth half? Like a proxy we could take is the number of people actually taking rides here and there. But then that in some cases can be self-reinforcing. Meaning if I'm really good in downtown, just more people are going to take rides in downtown than outside. Maybe there's a lot of rides outside, but I'm not seeing them, and so I'm not prioritizing that. So it's kind of a feedback problem. So usually you want to actually combine different metrics to give you like an easy number and have it all automated. So I could say, for example, today, all the downtime forecasts errors are weighted 1, and all the errors in the suburbs are weighted 0.5. So suddenly I can roll them up, sum them up, and I get my total error, which I can track week over week to see how my forecasts are doing. So that's a way. But yeah, there's always tricky things, and it really depends on the story you're trying to tell and also where you want to align the company to.
Have you had an experience when you targeted a specific metric and it turned out the opposite, for example?
100%, yes. Especially, so then when, that's what you want to, that's when teams also, that's also something to be very careful is sometimes you don't control 100% of your metric. So for example, you are, let's say you want to reduce your logistics costs and you do all this work to reduce your logistics costs and suddenly your costs double because the oil price doubled. And there's nothing you can do to reduce the oil price, assuming you're a logistics company or whatever. And then you need to, that's when you get into experimentation, which is also something that I do, which is you actually need to take the noise out from outside. It's just very hard. But usually that's why you have 3 or 4 metrics. Ideally, the 3 or 4 metrics you choose are not highly correlated, especially on external factors. So for example, even Lyft and Uber, heavily dependent on the macroeconomic cycle. Because let's say right now Donald Trump fired a ton of people, so if people don't have a job, they start driving. Now, if I see my drivers spike up, is it because we did something good? No, it's purely something that's happening outside. But you can think of that. If you see some metrics are heavily influenced, you can try what is the impact that you're seeing. For example, how much many new customers am I getting? If even my cost doubled, so I had to double the cost of my service, maybe I'm still getting a lot of customers because my competitors quadrupled their price, so we're actually doing better. And so that's where you kind of need to try and focus on what is the metrics that make sense. For us, for example, for Lyft, it could be, well, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, and we do that, we have highly statistical tools, which take a lot of statistical things. We do control groups. So for example, we change the price for 90% of people, but not 10%, to see if we're doing better or worse compared to the traditional 10%. So there's a lot of statistical techniques, and when you have a lot of data, you can do a lot of that large statistics stuff, which is very complicated, by the way. But there's now platforms that do it for you. For example, Epo, or there's another company which you can just technically integrate. For example, if you're doing some changes on your website and you want to see do people convert more or less, if you don't want to build an experimentation platform, you can connect with these services. Epo is one, and there's another one. Maybe you can read me later. I'll look it up for you. And that's what Google and Facebook do all the time when they do a change. They always experiment because, again, you don't know if maybe a leader of a country says something bad about your platform, your users drop. So you do a change, and then your users drop, but it's not really because of a change, because they would have dropped anyway. So, got a question down there? Sorry.
Yeah, actually, I was curious to understand, as a product manager now, how would you suggest someone getting out of university prepares to become a product manager?
Yeah, that's a great question because it changes a lot. So I think there's 3 or 4. That's actually was last time I talked with the Silicon Valley. We talked more about this. Would say there's not a lot of. There's either some big companies offer what's called APM, Associate Product Manager, which is how you enter. But the truth is that a product manager, you need to have some experience, usually even in software engineering, operations, whatever industry you're going, business. So usually the main paths to become a product manager are from a software engineering path. So somebody's a software engineer. They usually don't agree with executives or with a product manager. So they're like, I want to be a product manager because these people don't understand anything. And so they do that. That's a good path because usually people, like product managers need to do trade-offs. I guess what product managers do is on the metrics side is they do trade-offs. They need to decide if we do this, then what's the good and the bad? So they often complain with engineering because engineering wants to do things perfectly, but that costs time and money. And so product managers say do it less perfectly, which engineers don't like because you want to do a good job. You don't want to do a half-ready job. So that's what product managers are doing. When engineers don't agree with that, they become product managers. And they usually do very good product managers. The other one is data scientists. So data scientists nowadays are the people who really look at the metrics, configure the metrics, make sure that we can automatically pipe the data to come up with metrics and information and tests and experiments. Because they have a really good idea of all the data of a company, they usually can start seeing trends and things which means they become good product managers. The other ones, there's increasing a number of people who become product manager from consulting, so like strategy. That, unfortunately, I see doesn't work super well in tech companies. It works well in operations-heavy companies. Like, for example, Airbnb is heavily operational, like just managing stuff. But tech doesn't work very well because they tend to see everything in a strategy world of like, I write a strategy and people are going to execute it. But it doesn't work that way. You write a big strategy and then it's unclear how to execute it. You need to run trade-offs and they don't understand tech, so then it's a little harder for them to talk to engineering. And then the last one which is a little bit of a mix of a DS and a strategy, is the analysts, which again, very like the data scientists, but less technical, who just look at dashboards. Again, I've seen that happen, but usually the 2 best paths would be from data science and software engineering. Oh, the last one actually was very good. So what I did is project management. So project manager, again, some cases is very similar to product manager. I say to be a good product manager, you have to be a great project manager, but the opposite is not true. So project manager, usually you can enter a company and they tell you, this is the project. You go talk to everyone who's involved and figure out how to deliver it, who needs to deliver what are the times, and it's very good because you see the whole company. But usually you see a project end to end, so you talk to engineering, compliance, data, marketing. You get a good understanding of what are all the parts, and usually that's given to you, and then at some point you can start actually defining, actually you need to do this, you need to do that. So that's the last one.
In terms of interviews, do the interviews differ depending on the
company?
Of the candidate?
So it depends. Big companies have standardized processes, which, by the way, I hate. So at Lyft, we have a standardized process. A set of questions I can choose from when I go interview candidates. There's what's called more like a product. We call it product sense in Facebook. It's called something similar. But there's more one which is like creative thinking, essentially. How would you solve this problem? There's another one which is more metrics driven. How do you measure this problem? And if you see these results, what does it mean? And then usually there's more like a general experience. Those are terrible, by the way. They're really bad. So if they're bad, or if you go to startups, it's very much random. Like people just ask you whatever.